Flats Oral History Project. I'm Hannah Nordhaus. I'm here interviewing Mark Graf at the Jefferson County Airport in his hangar, and we are sitting in front of his very interesting airplane, which is not in the picture, but I'll have to get it later. So Mark, to start out, if you just want to tell me a little bit about your background, when you were born, where, what your parents did, that sort of thing.
I was born in 1960 in Denver. My father had worked at Rocky Flats prior to my birth, and so I grew up knowing of the existence of Rocky Flats all my life. He had worked as a welder and welded some of the duct work in building 771. At that time they were two-digit buildings, so it was building 71.
So he was there from the beginning?
He'd worked off and on as a sheet metal worker for various contractors that had contracts at Rocky Flats.
And did he, when you were a kid, did he tell you what Rocky Flats did?
No, he did not.
So
he
when
did not.
When did you figure that out?
In the 70s, I was in high school, and I was in physics class, and there was an anti-nuclear demonstration here at the Rocky Flats plant. And I was one of the pro-nuclear power demonstrators back in the early days. So along that time, I started to talk with my physics instructor and my chemistry instructor, and got kind of an understanding of what the nuclear weapon was and what was produced out of Rocky Flats.
And so you went to school in Denver, and tell me a little bit about your work.
I went to school in Jefferson County and graduated from the Jefferson County Schools District. I went to college in the University of Colorado at Denver, and while I was attending college, I decided I'd go to work full-time, and I started working at Rocky Flats June 14th, 1982 as a drafter.
As a drafter?
For a job that was going to last me 3, maybe 4 years.
What is a drafter?
I was drawing back in the old days. We didn't use computer-aided drafting. We used lines and T-squares and ink and pencil. Mm-hmm. And we helped the engineers produce drawings to make whatever. My first job was in building 371 engineering, where I worked for a gentleman by the name of Ron Jenkins, and my main job was process diagrams, but he soon learned that I was more than just a sharp pencil, and I got to work with the engineers on quite a few designs.
So you said that lasted 3 or 4 years, or you're hoping it would last 3 or 4 years?
When I first started, I thought it would last 3 or 4 years while I finished a degree. I found that engineering was not paying very well at that point. There was quite a few unemployed engineers. Mm-hmm. And so job advancement was not there, and so I went into the security department 2 years later in June of 1984.
And you say, was your dad, did your dad have a college degree too? Or
no, he did not.
And did your mom work?
No, she was a stay-at-home mom most of my life.
So you decided that engineering, there are a lot of unemployed engineers, particularly at Rocky Flats, or
in the Denver metropolitan area, there was kind of a slump in the market, and there were quite a few engineers that were taking up drafting and designer jobs. There was not a lot of opportunity for me to excel. I worked on a couple of projects with the alarm systems group, and I got an offer to go into the security department, and that's when I jumped ship.
So what did you do with the security department?
I started out as a security inspector. That was what we called ourselves at that point. Spent 2 years in the field, spent another couple years in the alarm station as a dispatcher, and then I was promoted to an investigator position, and alarm station coordinator is what my title was at that point. That was 1989. I worked for a gentleman by the name of Charles Wilson.
So what was your, as an investigator, what did you do?
Well, if I can go back to the inspector, I got to walk the routes when it was single-person routes. We used to walk a guard tour, what we called a guard tour, every 2 hours So every building had a presence in it, and we'd check the utility areas and the production areas, and we'd check the cafeterias and the utility worker areas to make certain that everything was as safe as it could be. I had a lot of time alone inside the material areas. I watched many of the components that are now in nuclear weapons going through their non-destructive testing. It was a pretty interesting period of time. I could walk up and talk to chemical operators and ask them what they were doing, why they were doing it. And they were, when I first got there, they were very quiet. There was information on the site was very compartmentalized. If you worked in building 444, you didn't say what was done in 444 if you were talking with somebody in 771. During that period of time, it somewhat broke loose. When I first started, there were only 2,500 employees on the facility. That eventually grew to well over 10,000. But during the peak of production, we only had 2,500, 25 to 2,700 employees on the facility. So it was an interesting time. I got to learn a lot about what made the nuclear weapon tick, what made the components special, some of the processes that you will see nowhere else in the world. I mean, it's not done anywhere else. So there were some very interesting people, some very dedicated people, and some very odd people as well.
How so?
We had one janitor who, he'd convinced his wife that his job was so secret he couldn't tell her what his job was. So she had an emergency in the middle of the night one night, and she called our center and said she had to talk with whatever this janitor's name was. And we asked her what department. Well, he doesn't tell me. He'd worked there for 5 or 10 years, and he didn't tell her that he was a janitor. There was a lot of misconceptions about what information security was at that time. And like most people that are willing to do their job, people were going overboard quite a bit.
So do you think this guy had a misconception that he had to keep his job a secret, or do you think he was trying to impress his wife?
I don't know. I have no idea. But it was kind of an interesting reaction to work at Rocky Flats. There were a lot of people that just didn't feel that they could say what they did. I worked with one person who, even though he was trained as an information protection specialist, a classifier, as I was eventually, he'd never really tell his family what he did. And yet he had something to be very proud of. And so there's a lot of misconceptions as far as what went on at Rocky Flats. And there are a lot of misconceptions as far as what the risks were and what were not risks. The day-to-day work was very safe to some degree. Stop.
You were saying that there are misconceptions about the safety, and day-to-day it was safe to some degree, and that's what it was.
A lot of the industrial safety issues were well taken care of at Rocky Flats. Slip and fall hazards, electrocution hazards. Of the 2 fatalities that occurred at Rocky Flats, to my knowledge, there was one auto pedestrian accident, and there was one electrocution with high voltage. But so that's a pretty good record, and the industrial safety portion was fairly good. There were a lot of unknown safety issues, though. There were exposure safety issues. For example, I walked the route in building 444, and in 444 we did beryllium production, and as a result I got to walk through the beryllium production rooms, and I've tested positive for beryliosis. Is it something that stops me from living? No, and I don't have any obvious signs right now, and I'm taking care of myself, and hopefully it'll never manifest into anything significant, but it's part of those unknowns. What is the effect going to be of the radiation that I was exposed to for years? I don't know. We've had generations predicate me, and they've lived and they've done well, but I think each person's physiology reacts to systems and exposures differently.
Seems like
I know what it was. When I went to work at Rocky Flats at 21, I had hair. And when I left at 45 or 44, I didn't have any hair. So it must have been the radiation.
You know, one thing that I found interesting in the interviews I've done is that the people make this distinction between industrial safety and this long-term exposure, and you know, the public seems much more frightened by the long-term exposure issues.
And they have a right to be. Who
And,
knows?
you know, is that something? But every time when I talk about safety with people who worked at Rocky Flats, they really focus on industrial safety exclusively, almost. And I
Well,
wonder if
that's what people measure.
Yeah.
And that's okay. When you compare Dow Chemical and Rockwell International and EG&G and Kaiser, ICF Kaiser and Kaiser Hill, safety records to industrial security, or excuse me, to industrial safety records of other companies, it's very good. And it should be. Because this is the key to the kingdom. This is the big stick that a nation can carry. And failure to protect your employees from it, or failure to protect the public from it, is criminal in my mind. I'm very clear on that. It's criminal. As a security professional, I got to learn what was right and what was wrong with the Department of Energy security program. There are a lot of things very good about it. There were a lot of things that had failed. And part of that information protection issue comes into play. What is classified and what is not classified? What can you talk about and what can you not talk about? The executive order clearly states that it will not be used. The DOE orders.
That what?
The classified information will not be used to protect someone from malfeasance or misconduct. And yet I saw time after time where classified information was abused in that manner.
Can you, I'm having a hard time, can you explain?
For example, if I had a complaint about how security was being done, and you're the Department of Energy, or you're one of the contractors, all you have to do is say it's classified, I can't tell you. And it never comes to light. The people that have the clearances, who are supposed to be overseeing the Department of Energy, in many cases were asleep at the switch, and I'll give you an example. The Conway Committee, which I provided the VIP protection for, as one of the investigators, and plain clothes and all the fun things at Rocky Flats that involved. I drove them around. I got them through the checkpoints. I made certain that their processes were appropriate and their contacts were appropriate. But soon after the Conway Committee visited Rocky Flats, the FBI raid occurred. And then we had subsequent visits from the Conway Committee, and now that's the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. So there's certainly a requirement when you have that kind of responsibility, that kind of authority, there's an equal or greater responsibility to treat it properly. So in other words, if you're going to classify information, you have to make certain that there's somebody there making certain it has to be classified. You have to make certain that the information is not being classified just to protect somebody from a lawsuit, to protect somebody from embarrassment. That's a big responsibility. And I would say right now that's one of the key problems in our government, is there's a lot too much classified information, and it doesn't need to be.
And there's more and more things are being, and it seemed like there was a period when
The Patriot Act scares the hell out of me.
yeah, when before that they had sort of loosened up on the classification rules, and now they've.
Well, Hazel O'Leary came forward with her openness treaty, and I think that was a good effort on her part. She gave a little bit too much, as far as I was concerned, as a classifier on weapons information. But she didn't give hardly anything in national security information, and that's really where a lot of the issue, at least in my mind, fell. If the material wasn't secure, it could not be safe. And just because the department chose to keep it quiet, doesn't mean that there weren't problems, and still are problems. I may get to read the newspaper every now and then and understand what Peter Stockton with the POGO or Government Accountability Project, GAP in Washington State, what they're doing. And it doesn't take a whole lot for me to interpolate what's going on behind the scenes. My information is dated. I haven't worked for a contractor for the Department of Energy since since 2004 now. But I'm real proud of the work that I did.
So, speaking of the work that you did, let's go back to when you were inspector and just sort of fill in
Okay.
the gaps here.
Sorry, I bounced around a little bit.
That happens.
I worked various posts, various functionalities. I was in a car. I did scan duties, which we would let people in and out of the material access areas. In the alarm station, I got to learn some of the alarm systems, some of the communication systems that we had available. And I had a somewhat of a grasp of the English language. I could write it and read it, and so as time went on and more reports were required, I was promoted on up the chain. Inspectors were tasked with emergency response, and to start with, emergency response was kind of a second thought. Because it was so quiet, because it was so compartmentalized, there'd be little emergencies throughout the facility that very few people would know about. I wouldn't say that that was an active cover-up. I would just say that because there wasn't information exchanged freely and openly, that not everybody knew what was going on.
Were they things that people needed to know about?
I think in some cases. For example, one night I was on duty and we had a fire in building 444. Building 444 was non-nuclear, well, non-plutonium. It was uranium production, beryllium production. There was a plating lab, and in the plating lab there was a cyanide room, and this cyanide room had caught fire. And the fireman that was responding had the joy of walking into an environment that he knew could potentially cost him his life. I think the fireman was probably trained to a point, but I don't think he knew exactly where he was going. He didn't know exactly what he was walking into. And because of that, his stress level was up, and because of that, his performance was down. Now, as a result, there was no cyanide that was breached, but when he was walking in, nobody knew that. And that's a critical element in how we look at how the emergency was handled. So, information protection, classified information can have a double-edged sword. It's got a great protection for national security, but it's got an equal side there where maybe the people that are walking into that arena need to know what they're walking into. So I have mixed feelings on that, really.
I think it's a systemic problem. They just need to find a new system where people can know what they need to know before they need to know it, or?
Well, I think the department tries to do that, but unfortunately things happen very quickly in the Department of Energy in a lot of ways. It's slowed down a little bit now, but I still have friends that work in the department. I still have friends that went to other facilities, Sandia, some up to Idaho, some to Hanford, Washington. We're not that large of a group, so the family kind of stays together. I spent 20-some years with those folks. I spent more time with them than I did with my kids. And some of them I love like they were my children, my family. They're very important. The classification issue is been battled around in Congress over and over. And they make laws to protect whistleblowers, and they make laws to make it so, but they don't spend the time to follow up. And that's really the problem. They encourage people to step forward, and then when they do, they get shot down. So, and I am a former whistleblower for the department, not for the department, to the Department of Energy and its contractors. And I would do it again in a heartbeat, but I certainly wouldn't tell someone else to do it.
So do you want to tell me the circumstances of your whistleblowing, or do you want to sort of go through your career?
Let's go through the career first. As an investigator, I got the opportunity to deal with derogatory information. So we would collect all the derogatory information on people. We would do investigations on crimes against the Department of Energy. We had everything at the facility from stabbings, domestic situations. We had hoaxes. We had a fake bomb threat. We had a box that was put in building 771 that said, "This is not a bomb." Well, somehow that didn't, the writing on the outside of the box didn't quite convince us, and we ended up dealing with that. I was put in charge of the response for the hazardous material chemical neutralization project. There were crystallized bottles of crystallized ether in various parts of the laboratories inside the facilities, and I got to work with the companies that came out and neutralized those chemicals, the removal. That brought a few tight times. You can imagine the risk of having a highly explosive chemical inside a radiation control area. And not quite every step was choreographed, but it was very close. And that was good. We did good work those days. We made certain that everything that could be done to prevent a situation was done.
So as an investigator, what was your role in I assume there's someone who's sort of charged with making sure that this material didn't explode. Your role was sort of oversee those people, or?
My role was to oversee those people that were doing the work, yes, and to coordinate the emergency response, because I knew what the alarm station could do, and I knew what the protective force could do, and I knew what the fire department could do, and I knew where the shift superintendent was and where the radiation control technicians were. So we brought it all together underneath the shift superintendent's review, but I was in charge of the security response. We had uncleared workers basically in a classified production area removing materials because nobody else wanted to wear that big, thick aluminum foil suit.
So you were there to make sure nothing untoward happened?
Nothing stupid happened. And to our credit, nothing stupid did happen.
So as an investigator, were you, your job was it limited to what happened on site?
There were a couple off-site responses. We had some off-site facilities, and our color of authority extended to on-duty Department of Energy facilities. And so there were times when I came up to Broomfield and did some investigations in the Broomfield area. There were times when we caught a theft at one point of an individual trying to remove some very expensive property from the facility. He'd been stealing for years, and just before Christmas, and we had to go collect and gather the evidence. So we got a few off-site trips, but most of the time we stayed on site. The protective force would patrol the outer boundary because the highway is the easy way to do it as opposed to getting through the mud and tearing up the terrain. So we had a lot of emergency response to the outside of the facility as well. We were the only law enforcement agency between Golden and Boulder on Highway 93. And there were a lot of accidents on Highway 93. There were a lot of accidents on Indiana. 128 wasn't too bad. Highway 72 was pretty bad. It's odd, I can still drive past those areas and just picture and smell the accidents and what had happened there. And there were fatalities there. There's no doubt about it. Some of our best work was done supporting the population around us.
So, were you also investigating security clearance type stuff, or
security clearance type stuff? We would gather what's called derogatory information. The employees were tasked with bringing us information. Should they have a brush with the law? Should they have a domestic situation? They were tasked with bringing us that information. We'd gather that, and then we'd share that with the Office of Personnel Management or the FBI, depending on who was doing the clearance background check.
And decide whether the person could still be trusted with their clearance?
We wouldn't do the decision. We would just gather the information, send the report to the Department of Energy, and Department of Energy made the clearance decision.
Now, I interviewed one woman who said that she had people sort of come up to her in bars and ask her what she did. This was years ago, and that they were plants trying to figure out if she
was going to leak or not.
Yeah.
I won't say it didn't happen. There were a lot of people that were overzealous in their work. There were some people that didn't understand the rules and the regulations and the laws. You know, when you take on the commitment of providing a security clearance, that means you're going to do business the right way and the fair way. And sometimes, if there's a shortcut, maybe somebody took that shortcut. I can't say one way or the other. I know I didn't, and I know that the investigators I worked with did not. We had high levels of integrity.
So that I didn't know if that was considered not to be, if that was part of the job description to try to...
I never did that. I know at one point there was one person who volunteered to be a plant at an anti-nuclear rally around the facility, and we reminded him that he could do what he wanted to on his own time, but that we certainly weren't going to ask him for any information nor take any information from him. So I don't know if he showed up or not.
And those policies, did they change over the years in terms of?
Yes. Just like the information security policy kind of changed, the internal communications improved, and people started to understand what was actually going on the facility. That may be part to my maturity in the system as well, but I saw a clear communication, especially after the '89 FBI raid. A lot of walls were broken down. Internal communications started up. People started to understand what was going on. The facility was shut down by the Conway Committee. Department of Energy said we will close because it's unsafe what we're doing, and it was. Not industrial, although it could have had industrial connotations. We had a situation, more than one situation, where a utility worker was cleaning a glove box, mixed the wrong chemicals together, and boom, explosion. Well, that's, not only is that an industrial accident, now it's also a radiological accident because of the contamination. So there's a lot of times where those two lines would cross. And that's when you start to ask yourself the question of how many exposures, how much can I get? How's this going to affect me down the road?
As a security person, did you feel that you were as likely to be exposed to dangerous
Yes.
materials?
We were walking through areas that hadn't had people in them for hours, and some of the processes were left unattended. There were times you'd walk into one side of the room and the door would not be posted. If there was a contamination area, the doors would be posted. So you'd walk in one side of the room, the sign wasn't there. You'd walk out, and there would be the sign that says respirator protection required. How many times? Dozens. How many exposures? I don't know.
When that happened, would you go be tested, or?
We got tested on a regular basis. We got our urinalysis done. We got a lung count done, I think, every other year. We had chest x-rays as part of our physical. I don't know how accurate all that was. I know that there were people that would take the thermoluminescent dosimetry badges, the TLDs, and on purpose radiate them to high levels, set them on radiation areas, high radiation areas, and the next quarter their reports had come back with zeros. So I don't know if they just thought it was a high radiation area. I don't know if the measuring system was accurate. I don't know if there was somebody who knew these people were playing. I don't know. But I can tell you that I didn't have a lot of faith in the system. And that faith eroded as I got to know how things were being done, at least how I interpreted things were being done. And the production and the goals of the department would be met, period.
Do you think that these hazards that you're exposed to are endemic to a place that handles these materials, or do you think that they could have done it much more safely?
They could have done it much more safely, but I think that when you give Department of Energy, Congress, who's supposed to be overseeing them, the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, which is also supposed to be overseeing the Department of Energy, and the NNSA, the National Nuclear Non-Proliferation Security Administration, which is now part of the Department of Energy. All those oversight agencies should be doing a better job. But there's a problem there, and it's the motivation is apparently not there, because nobody's going to oversee them because it's all classified information. When you remove that veil, then all of a sudden people have to perform. And I would like, personally, I'd like to see a review of that, because it's costing the taxpayers a lot of money. It's putting them at risk when it doesn't have to be.
So you think that a lot of information that is classified shouldn't be,
Yes.
and classification is a way to cover up your mistakes?
Yes. And to make certain nobody ever sees it. I can guarantee you don't have a copy of the 1996 Site Safeguard Security Plan from Rocky Flats. And I know why.
Why?
Because it's classified. Now ask the next question, why is it classified?
Why is it classified?
It blows my mind because the facility's not even standing anymore. All the conditions that were documented in that are gone. And yet it's still classified.
Because, I mean, were they trying to, at that point, cover up?
I got involved in 1995. We'd had a series of changes. The radiological sabotage target, do you want to stop for a few minutes? Do you want to stop for a few minutes?
Sure. Well, then, we're back.
Okay. In 1995, I became involved in, I'd observed certain things were going on behind classified doors. The radiological sabotage target amount, which is the amount of material it would take for an adversary to get a hold of and put into the air and contaminate the surrounding area in excess of federal requirements, federal law. That amount had moved from 6.3 kilograms to 19.6 kilograms, 19.2 kilograms, up to 64 kilograms. And I became very concerned about what was going on, what I saw happening. The security boundaries were being moved so that more production could take place. And production was, they were packaging the materials for Rocky Flats, for the closures of Rocky Flats, which was okay. But on one hand, we had a radiological sabotage target amount of 64 kilograms, roughly 130 pounds. And on the other hand, we had a safety envelope that was 1 kilogram. And it didn't make sense to me.
Safety envelope being
There was
more than 1 kilogram and
of this material in a plastic package. Somebody years ago thought if you wrap plutonium in plastic, it won't oxidize. And if it doesn't oxidize, hey, we don't rust. We don't have plutonium powder, which is very dangerous as far as movement is concerned. Okay, not a bad idea, except they found out later that the plastic would break down and hydrocarbons would be produced and eventually hydrogen would be produced. So now in this drum of plutonium, you'd have a hydrogen mix, hydrogen gas mix. And that's, of course, explosive. Okay, so if that was going to go off in the back of a truck at 1 kilogram and spread a contamination in Denver that exceeded the federal law limit, then how did 64 kilograms in a security scenario equate? I didn't see the equation.
And the idea was that they could move as much of this stuff as possible, as quickly as possible.
Yes,
By
and
making
produce
that,
as much.
that envelope.
Higher and higher and higher.
Okay, get
Yes. And there were people that would limit the scenarios to help themselves. There would be people that told me that I was worrying about security too much, but that was my job. And so I contacted a gentleman by the name of Ted Taylor, who was in the Manhattan Project. He's designed the largest, smallest, and most efficient weapons in our nuclear stockpile. And Dr. Taylor is a very brave man. And I told him what had happened, and I told him the basic material that we were working with. And he told me, Mark, that isn't your problem. Your problem is an improvised nuclear weapon. Well, the department had worked for years to make the biggest bang out of the smallest amount of material. So there were a lot of failures. But that didn't mean that you couldn't make a small bang out of a lot of material. And so I raised the question and got told not to worry about it. The appropriate people were worried about it, but I kept seeing these levels increase. And so I got involved in a whistleblowing event with Congressman Skaggs. The letter was deemed classified. Interesting scenario how that worked. Later proven not to be classified. And some investigation was conducted, but the investigation was short-tracked. 4 people from the local area were involved. None of them had a nuclear background. They were all impressed by the guns, the bullets, the chain guns we had, the bulletproof vests, the light armored vehicles, all those fun things. Very impressive, but only effective when you deploy them and you deploy them correctly. Just like a fire extinguisher, it only works if you use it the right way. Doesn't matter if it's hanging on the wall. Push comes to shove, Department of Energy and I don't see eye to eye on those things. As a result, I don't work for them or for their contractors any longer. I wish I had. I wish I could. I felt my job was only part of the way done. And not the job that I was assigned to do, but I was entrusted by the taxpayers, by the government, by you, to hold a clearance and to protect that information. But with that authority comes an equal responsibility. What are they not telling you? What are they covering up? That's the question. I know, at least at Rocky Flats, what they were covering up, part way. Doesn't matter now. It's closed. But it should matter to the people of Savannah River.
So, so your concern were the amounts of material that were being moved then, would you say, to put it in layman's terms?
The amounts of material, what we were putting them into, we were taking plutonium ingots, turning them into plutonium rust, plutonium powder, PU oxide. And the PU oxide was then going to be transferred and shipped. Well, like talcum powder, if it was one piece, it's easier to keep track of. If it's powder and it's shipped, what happens to it? Now, I do understand, and I trust the chemical analysis that says it's more in a fire status, it's safer to be in the oxide status. It's not going to go further. In the metal status, it's going to oxidize, and you're going to cause maintenance to the material. But I would have thought the maintenance would have been better done at its permanent facility, not all at once in a hurry to ship something and shut it down. Mm-hmm. But that was somebody else's decision. Excuse me. But what I didn't like was the fact that these numbers kept going higher. Now remember, at that time I'm a lieutenant. There were times when I was single-handedly in charge of the protective force, and I was going to tell people to rush in there and shoot people and kill people to leave that material there. Well, you don't tell me that side of the coin without telling me the rest of the story. And the rest of the story was that this material is not inherently safe. This is not something you want your children to play with. It's warm to the touch. Have you ever touched plutonium?
No.
Through a lead-lined glove, I picked up a plutonium ingot, and it was warm to the touch. And being naive when I was younger, I said, well, isn't this nice? They preheat the metal so that people's hands can work through the gloves and not get sore. I said, no. It's naturally that way, as natural as plutonium can be. That's pretty impressive. That's very impressive. There's a lot of energy in that stuff. So as I put everything together, back on. You don't tell people that they're going to risk their lives You don't brief them on threat scenarios and then expect them not to put those things together. Why? Why is it so important? Because this is the big stick. This is something that makes a nuclear meltdown like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island look very, very small in comparison. One of the scenarios I put together with some of the people I worked with was an improvised nuclear weapon in a nuclear facility. If you've got an improvised explosive that goes nuclear and it reaches 10 million degrees Fahrenheit, and if it produces 200,000 pounds equivalent of TNT, you've got a pretty big bang. Now, if you put that bang next to 21 metric tons of nuclear materials, you've got a real mess. You've got property values in Denver that are real cheap for a very long period of time. Half-life is 24,500 years. So I felt it was my responsibility to say something to Congress, to say something to the oversight groups. Please look into this. I'm not the expert. Look into this.
So how did you decide to do this? Who did you?
A gentleman by the name of Jeff Peters and I worked together. Jeff was the director of operations. I was one of his lieutenants. I was also a classifier. And he wanted help writing the letter to Congressman Skaggs.
So he was in agreement with you. This is your supervisor.
Yes.
And he agreed that this was not.
This was not good.
At this point, is this Kaiser Hill at this point, or is this EG&G?
This was right after the transition from EG&G to Kaiser Hill. In fact, the event that predicated it and that instigated it was we were selling a vault, room 3331 in building 371, to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And they were going to store a lot of plutonium oxide in this vault. I don't believe that number would be classified. No, it can't be, because it's IAEA. 490 kilograms of plutonium oxide in this room. And this 490 kilograms of plutonium oxide was going to be checked and statused by IAEA to prove that the U.S. was not manufacturing nuclear weapons with it. Well, EG&G was on their way out, and the IAEA wasn't going to buy the vault until after they were gone. And Kaiser Hill was brand new to the game. They didn't care. They didn't know. There wasn't a transition plan that addressed it. So literally days before they were going to start modifying this vault for the IAEA specifications, they came up to us and said, we can't do it. The room is too hot for maintenance workers. Too much radiation exposure. Okay. Well, let's do something else with it then. Let's move it to an old vault. Instead, they put it in a soft room with a radio-controlled alarm system. And a radio control means you can turn it off via radio. Non-secure radio net. Trunked, but not secure. And that caused some significant concern, because there was 490 kilograms of plutonium oxide, not 164, or 128, or 96, or 92, or 16. 490 kilograms. And according to what I knew, that was more than enough to do the job. And we didn't have scenarios set up. We didn't have protection set up. We did what we were told. But at the conclusion of the project, it was a good example to Congress. This is a problem. You're going to have to ask yourself why this is a problem. To the best of my knowledge, the contractor made their dates and they made their bonuses.
So, so you and your supervisor wrote a letter to Congress? To whom?
Congressman David Skaggs.
Okay.
And within days, they were at my house, taking the disc, the ribbon off the printer.
They being?
Department of Energy. I was a classifier. I told them it wasn't classified, and I ended up, it was not classified. It went all the way to Washington, D.C. And some people with some integrity stepped forward and said, this is not classified. And to this day, I appreciate that. But it's a very expensive commodity, that integrity part, in the nuclear industry. Very expensive.
So, when they came to your house, and you said they took the tape and ribbons, they were basically trying to erase all evidence, all...
They were treating it as if there was a breach in classified information security. They were trying to contain any leak.
Did they arrest you?
No, they did not.
Were you subject to interrogations?
Yes, yes.
What was
Several.
What was that like?
It can be pretty intimidating when you hold a clearance and they say, you know, if you don't tell us the truth, we're going to take your clearance away. Okay, I'll tell you the truth. Not a problem. I told them the truth. The document was not classified, and it wasn't. So, but again, some people, and generally probably well-meaning, but I know that there was a lot of thought given to what's going to happen next. Unfortunately, they didn't think it all the way through. A better scenario would have been to work with us to protect the information, protect the materials. Up until that time, I really believed that the contractors that I was working with were trying to do the job. At that point, I started to believe that the contractors were trying to make money. And it didn't matter if you were doing the job or not. And I've learned further, I dug further, learned more, and some of the things we said we were doing in our security documents, we were not. In fact, we were making it worse. So.
What sort of things?
Oh, this is a good example, and I know it's unclassified because the building's no longer there. The protection strategy no longer exists. We had a thing called hardened fighting positions. We were supposed to roll in front of the vaults whenever we opened up the vaults, so that anybody behind the hardened fighting position could engage a target without being taken out immediately. The hardened fighting positions not only were not being used, but they were left unattended and unaccounted for. So not only did we not use it, but we left it for the adversary set to use it if they chose to attack. And we wouldn't have had any recourse.
And how did you learn all this stuff subsequently? I mean, did you sort of, once this happened, did you decide to make yourself a watchdog of sorts, or?
I knew that there were problems. It's like an iceberg. Once you see the tip of it, you want to find out where the rest of it lies. So that's what I did. I started to look into the security documents and read them with a critical eye instead of just reading them for what do I have to do? What does this mean I have to do as an officer? What does it mean I have to do for my team? So instead of just listening and going blindly along, I started to think, what does this mean? It became very uncomfortable very quickly.
Uncomfortable for you personally reading this? Or?
Personally. Well, you're making a decision on what you're going to do with your career. You're making a decision on what you're going to do with not your safety, everybody else's. I'm not trying to over-embellish my responsibility, I don't think. But at the same time, there we were, a team of people with handguns, rifles, machine guns, bulletproof vests, and we're protecting 21 tons of nuclear materials. And praying to God we weren't going to get hit. September 11th was a great day for me. I mean, it scared the hell out of me. It broke my heart. But it showed that people would do things against our government just to do them. I remember talking with one person who did the risk analysis for Building 371. The risk analysis of an airplane flying into Building 371 was low, because pilots, if they have an emergency, don't crash into buildings. They crash into the planes, the grounds. 9/11 proved that to be a wrong assumption. And yet there was a piece of paper that said it was a low risk. So the contractors, I don't think, were telling the government, and I don't think the government knew in some cases how deep to dig. Then once they started to see the flaws, I don't think they wanted to dig any further.
So when you took it upon yourself to review these security documents, were people aware you were doing this, or this is part of your normal job, but you were...
It was part of my normal job, but I was taking another look at it. There were some people that were aware that I was doing it. I was working with Jeff Peters. I was working with William Gillison, who was our manager for Wackenat at the time. And he knew I was working the issues. And he wanted me, and to his credit, he gave me permission. I want you to find where the holes are. And I admire that, I really do. I don't think they expected to see the holes we found. They were significant.
This was after your whistleblower issue had been resolved.
After the first
at this
one.
point?
After the first one.
The first,
He wanted it better documented, and I agreed that it needed to be better documented. Compare one document against another. We had 3 documents that showed the 371 stacker retriever at 3 different risk ratios at the same time,
So
under the same load.
stack of what?
Stacker retriever. It was also called the central storage vault at 371. It was the automated, supposed to be automated storage facility for plutonium and plutonium parts. And it had an inert atmosphere in it. And it was supposed to, it was supposed to be the automated storage so that you would reduce the amount of exposure to the workers. It's a good idea, really was. Was hell for security because there were so many openings. But I know of 3 documents that say low risk when the contractor is saying this is our security posture and it's okay. Moderate risk when the contractor wants to do a few upgrades, and high risk when the contractor wants to do significant upgrades and make more money. But it's all the same target, all at the same time, all under the same design basis load. It's confusing to me.
So then what did you do with all this information?
Gave it to my management. And like I said, I don't think they expected to see the holes that they saw. I think to some level they were appreciative, because we were, and I still try to remain very professional and appreciative of what they've done for me, because they've done an awful lot for me. In my career, I got an awful lot of good training, good understanding. There were also some surprises to them. I think they'd empowered some groups of people to speak for them, and I don't think those people were honest and forthright.
You mean secure in terms of the security, or?
In terms of security and in terms of risk. They said what they thought they wanted to be told.
Who were these people that they empowered?
Security planning,
Contractors usually, or?
contractors with government oversight. Some of these people are currently working at other facilities, making a lot more money than I do. But that's okay. I can look myself in the mirror. I know why I did it. I know who I did it for.
So so you had kept your job through the first whistleblowing episode. Did you were you formally considered a whistleblower again with this second episode?
Yes.
And who were you whistleblowing to?
I ended up talking with attorneys from the Government Accountability Project, good group of people working for the public, I believe working for the public, and a group called POGO, Project on Government Oversight, out of Washington, D.C., also a very good group of people.
These are nonprofits?
Nonprofits. Danielle Bryan runs POGO. Her husband, Peter Stockton, used to work Democratic chairman for Energy, Dingell. Used to work with Dingell. And Peter is great people in my mind. Just really good folks. They know more about the government than I do.
So you did this analysis, gave it to your managers, they didn't want to hear it, and then you went to POGO and GAP? I
didn't overtly go to POGO and GAP. I only went to GAP when they took action against me. I'd granted an interview with CBS. The Denver newspapers had a lot more information in them. They had talked with us a couple of times. But once it made the evening news with Dan Rather, it was much more visible, and so they took action against me, and that's when I believe I was doing what I was entrusted to do, to speak for the people of the United States, and I saw a risk that was inappropriate or fraudulent. And when they took those actions, I chose to contact an attorney as opposed to sitting still. I was out of work for 8 months. I was subjected to 3 psychological reviews, and I like the reason was I was over concerned with security. Well, I thought that was my job, but apparently I was overdoing my job. So, but I was eventually reinstated, and obviously there was pariah. There were people that felt their jobs were put in danger by what I'd done. There were people that thought I was a great guy because I did something worthwhile, or so they thought. But it was never the same, and it would never be, and it never will be the same. But I kind of figured that when I took the first step.
Were you put back into the same job?
Not initially. That took a little legal action to get done, but I was eventually put back into the same job. And I held excellent performance ratings all that time.
Okay, we're at 58 minutes, so let me stop and change the table before I ask more questions.
Sure.
Thanks.